Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this traditional opening morning session at Davos on the global economy. I'm Michael Elliott, the editor of Time International. This session's done in collaboration with us at Time Magazine, and I've had the great honor of doing this, I think, for 7 years. I look forward to it enormously because I'm always surrounded by people who have fantastic insights and experiences that they can share with us on a snowy opening morning at Davos. Those of you who've been to this session in the past will know that we're notorious for mangling metaphors. We've had the Goldilocks economy, we've had the congealed porridge economy, we've had a positive alphabet soup of recoveries from recession, U's, V's, W's, all sorts of stuff. And we're gathered here today at what I think is a historic moment in the world economy, where what I have christened the 1670 economy, where 16% of the world's population controls 70% of world economic output, may be shifting to a new model. To help us think about what's likely to happen in the year ahead, we have a panel with me up here, of which it really can be said they need no introduction, but I'll quickly run through them. Azim Premji, the chairman of Wipro in India, we're delighted to have with us this morning. Nouriel Roubini, professor of economics and international business at the Stern School at NYU. Zhu Min, whose fantastic contributions at these panels in years gone by has now led him to be a special advisor at the IMF. That must be the reason, I think. But Zhu Min...
because of your recommendation.
Zhu Min joined us again. Martin Sorrell from WPP.
One basis of this, you should be in advertising, Michael.
I'm next to the master. And Jim Turley from E&Y. As we've done in the last few years, I'm going to ask Nouriel to kick us off with a synoptic view of where we are, and then we'll go on from there. Nouriel.
It's a pleasure being here again this year. If I had to characterize the global economy, I have here in front of me a glass is half empty and half full, and I think that's a fair representation of the global economy. There are some positives and there are some upside risks, and there are some negatives and some downside risks. So I'd like to cover both of them. I would say that if you want to emphasize the half of the glass that is full and the positive, there is a global economic recovery, both in advanced economies and emerging markets, is stronger in emerging markets. That's a first positive and is ongoing. And the recent data are showing some global economic growth acceleration. The second positive is that the tail risk of an outright double-dip recession in advanced economies and the risk of outright deflation are lower than they were last year. And of course, that's a positive, even if the latest data from the United Kingdom, even from the periphery of the Eurozone, suggests that the risk of a double dip or even a long-term stagnation are not gone forever. The third positive is that the balance sheets of the high-grade corporates in the United States and other advanced economies like Europe are strong. They've been slashing costs, especially labor costs, that are flush with profits, with cash. And if they want to do more capex spending and more hiring, they have the money to do so. And their confidence is rising. Therefore, that could be generating greater economic growth. The fourth strength of the global economy is that emerging markets are doing well, both cyclically and structurally. There is still high economic growth in China and India, not just in Asia, but also in Latin America and parts of the Middle East, and even in sub-Saharan Africa. And the fifth positive about the global economy is that last year there was a period of risk on and risk off. Risk was off after the Greek crisis, the Irish crisis, when there were worries about double-dip recession. Right now, risk aversion has been increasing. We're in risk-on mode. There is asset reflation in equity market. Credit spreads have fallen. And that means that there is going to be an improvement in balance sheets through positive wealth effects and through reduction in credit costs. So those are the positives of the global economy. What are the potential negatives and the downside risks for the global economy? First of all, in my view, economic growth in most advanced economies, US, Europe, Japan, is going to be anemic, subpar, below trend, because this painful process of private and public sector deleveraging is still ongoing. It's going to continue for the next few years. The second problem we have in advanced economies is the rise of sovereign risk, large budget deficit, rising stocks of public debt, And within specifically the case of the Eurozone is not just sovereign risk, but also risk of further trouble. You have public debt that are high, but also private debt that are high. We have low competitiveness. We have low economic growth, actually outright contraction still in Spain, in Ireland, in Greece, and barely positive economic growth in Portugal and Italy. So what's happening in the Eurozone certainly is one of the biggest risks to the global economy. The third downside risk to the global economy comes from the recent rise in oil, energy, food, and commodity prices. It has three negative effects. It leads to a rise in inflation, especially in high-growing emerging markets. Is leading to a reduction in disposable income around the world among commodity importers, especially advanced economies. And that's a negative for consumption and economic growth. And now it's leading also to social and political instability. Look what's happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, Morocco, Algeria. This rise in food prices is becoming a serious social and political problem. And this rise in inflation in overheating emerging markets where growth is too high, inflation is rising, there's excessive credit growth, asset bubble is leading to another challenge. Will these emerging markets, starting with China and India, be able to tighten enough and fast enough and have a soft landing of their economy, maintaining high growth and controlling inflation? That's a question mark. It could be a risk for the economies and for the markets. A fourth downside risk to the global economy comes from the U.S. U.S. this year might grow close to potential, but there are four potential downside risks from the U.S. High unemployment rate, since there's not going to be much job creation. 2, the housing market is already double-dipping. 3, there is a significant problems at the level of state and local governments, risk for the money bond market. And 4, the U.S. is doing very little about this long-term budget deficit. Even what the president proposed last night in the State of the Union is not going to go in the direction of significantly reducing the budget deficit. So there are even downside risks for the United States. 2 final downside risks is that the global current account imbalances are not shrinking. They're not shrinking because commodity prices are rising and there is not enough exchange rate adjustment. And in a world in which 10% is the growth rate of China and 10% is almost the unemployment rate of the United States, in which China is very much slowing down the rate of its own currency appreciation, is a world where these global imbalances, in which this currency tension can lead to currency wars and eventually to trade wars and protectionism. And finally, I would say the glass is half full because for the last 3 years, with a massive amount of monetary liquidity injection in the global economy and with a massive amount of fiscal stimulus. But right now, from the policy point of view, fiscal policy is going in the direction of austerity in advanced economies, in part because the markets are forcing it, bond vigilantes, in part because politics is forcing it. So we're not going to have fiscal stimulus, and there's going to be fiscal austerity. And because of the rise in inflation in both advanced economies and emerging markets, there is not going to be further significant quantitative easing in advanced economies, and emerging markets will have to tighten. So the policy stance is going to go in the direction of more austerity on the fiscal side, less liquidity stimulus, and that could be a negative for the markets and for the economies. So it's a kind of balanced situation in which there are some upside risks, but there are also a number of significant downside risks.
Thank you, Nouriel. Jumin, can you come in? And Nouriel made a couple of points on the performance of the large emerging economies, particularly India and China. The question of inflation there, the need for a soft landing, as Nouriel put it. How do you see things?
Well, as always, I always agree with Nouriel, and he's a professor. And for the emerging market, I think the growth is still very strong, although a little bit of a slowdown, which is very good and healthy. I think in Asia, roughly India and China still lead. China probably will end up with 9.5% GDP growth rates, obviously still lower than 10.3% last year. India probably will be 8.5 to 8.7, a little lower than 8.9 last year. So still have a very strong overall, if you're looking for all the regions in the emerging market, I think the growth can be very strong because what happened in the last years, we observed the trade pattern happen quite a bit because the intercontinental trade more become intra-trade. The trade become the Asia emerging market within themselves, from themselves to, for example, Latin American, from Middle East, it's really increased dramatically. So I think this is reduce the dependency on advanced economy demand, I think which is a big issue the investments really picked up. We expect to see that further pick up this year, become the main drive force for year 2011, particularly on the infrastructure investment as well. So I think that's a big and a huge business opportunity as well for the world. But obviously, as Nouriel says, there are also a few concerns. I mean, obviously, the first issue is the food price and the energy price. I mean, it's raised way high. I mean, the issue is not only there, because in India, for example, the food composes 47% of CPI. China, 34%. Pork, one item accounts 9% of Chinese CPI. So if you have a food price volatility, you will have a huge impact on the CPR. The real issue is on the supply side, because the labor cost increase, land cost increase, environmental cost increase, so the supply cost increase. So that's really affect to the second round, we call the general inflation pressures for the emerging market, particularly in the Asians. I think that's a pretty big issue, particularly because the output gap is very much closed in the Asian and emerging market.
So what do you anticipate to be the policy response in India and China to rising prices across the board? Energy, food, labor shortages, what have you?
Well, I think there's two side things. On the monetary side, both countries will further tight monetary policy, tighter liquidities, and further raise interest rates. I think that's important. But also on the supply side, provide more supply on the food side. I think on the food side, you will be able to do that. Obviously, on the commodity side, you need more international competition, which is the reason G20 picked up. I think this is very important. With two-hand side, we probably will be able to maintain the food and the commodity price increase. If we can get that done, I think the general inflation pressure will be released. But in Asia, is also, I mean, the second risk is for the capital flow, because we observed the liquidity is ample last year, and the capital flow is a huge move to emerging market, given emerging market have a much strong growth, less deficits, and the environment is better. Interest rates is much higher, right? I mean, so all this money go. What do we expect to see is a more portfolio capital move into the emerging market, which will be a real shift for global capital relocation. If that's the case, capital is huge. Capital inflow for emerging market, always good news, and the need for the financial sector, for the infrastructure investments. But you've got to be very careful if there's a short-term, very volatile capital flow can cause a negative impact on the financial stability and the macro stability as well. I think this is obvious, is the most important issue. But one thing I would really like to pick it out is new issues for this year. Because last year, we really have a two-speed recovery. Because advanced economy is much lower, 2.5% GDP growth rates. And the emerging market roughly have 7.2% GDP growth rate, so way lead. But what happened is this year, we're going to have a three-speed recovery. Because the advanced economy more or less remain 2.5, 2.8. Emerging market, a little lower to 6.8% growth rates. But between them, we have U.S. The U.S. probably will get the 3% GDP growth rate, which is quite strong. What does that mean for emerging market, for the global economy? The whole thing is, if you're really looking for U.S. economy, all the stimulus come from demand side, because it's a QE2, because of fiscal policy. So that will push the whole demand, domestic demand of the United States. Will push growth. We expect to see strong growth as a good, but it also means U.S. probably will increase more. That will make the emerging market exports more, which there's a potential risk for the world to go back to the old normal, which was before the 2007-08. Emerging market keep exporting, advanced economy keep importing, imbalance remain, as Nouriel mentioned. I think this is the big risk for the emerging market, because they have been successfully transfer their model from export-dependent model to domestic. Yeah. But now there's a big import demand there, and we need export from emerging market. So whether the emerging market will be able to keep the trends, further structural reform, keep the model to the more domestic demand-driven model, I think that's the key test for year 2011.
Azim, Premji, give us a perspective from India.
Just to take off what he said, inflation is really our key priority at the moment. It's really right on top of government priorities. And the hope is that we don't get a lot of knee-jerk reactions and a lot of freebies which go out to be able to contain some of the rising agitations of the very poor people. I think what is really happening is the slowdown of the Western world and the continued acceleration of the emerging world is really shifting balance of power in terms of where the consumption lies. And the way the trends are going in 10 years, the economies of the emerging worlds will be in excess of 20 trillion US dollars, which is equal to the size of the US economy today, roughly, in fact, a little larger than the size of the US economy. And in terms of households with disposable incomes above $10,000, in 5 years from today, there will be more than the households in US and Europe combined. I mean, that's a dramatic shift. This is also putting a new thrust on top on multinational corporations of getting emerging countries like India, in addition to China, much higher on focus, because that's where they see the growth coming from. And the good thing is that the end result is it has to result in some amount of reciprocity, that what they sell into India, they have to buy from India, whether it be in terms of services, whether it be in terms of products, whether it be in terms of services other than information technology services. So certain selective industries can get very interesting market opportunities coming out of it going forward.
Well, let's turn to two chief executive officers of extremely well-known multinational companies. So both of you have heard about the growth in the developing markets, and I'd like you to talk about opportunities there. But I'd like both of you also to say how you see your businesses in the Atlantic core, as it were, developing in the US and Western Europe. Martin, do you want to go first?
Well, I think first observation, there's very little left to say. Pack up and go home. But basically, I think, if one's honest about it, we're surprised, very surprised, where we are now. If you said to me on September the 14th, 2008, would WPP's revenues, say, in the second half of last year be back to where they were pre-Lehman or pre-monoline crisis or pre-subprime crisis, I would have said, you need your head examined. And we're also, regrettably, actually, 8% down in terms of the number of people employed in the company. Net down 12 in 2009 when the world was going to come to an end. 2010, we saw a little bit of expansion. Now, 2010, from our point of view, just to use your acronyms, was lovey-shaped rather than love-shaped. And the difference was that America, the traditional markets, the developed markets, actually, the mature markets, rebounded much more strongly than we thought. We were up 8% in America against 2% GMP growth. So America behaved really like a faster-growing market last year. Part of that was dead cat bounce. But part of it was also due to the fact, I think, that American corporates and Western corporates are really uncertain. And I don't think last night's speech really gets us further in terms of removing that uncertainty. Multinational corporates have about $2 trillion in cash on their unleveraged balance sheets. Their headcounts are down. There has not been productivity increases. There has been reductions in headcount. These companies are more efficient. The administration made the point to us in Washington at the Business Council, U.S. Business Council, a few months ago, that profits actually in the third quarter of last year were 30% better than before Obama took power. So they're much more efficient, but they're much more uncertain. Now, this year, we think the world will move to a more love-shaped basis. So we'll see Western Europe continuing to be tepid growth, Western continent, the Atlantic core. America more U-shaped. And the fast-growing markets, BRICS, Next 11, Civets, whatever your choice of acronym is, will continue to be V-shaped. The risks, the chief risk, I think, has been said, is inflation and what the interest rate response will be to that. The other risk is the political risk, what we've seen in North Africa, Tunis and Egypt, and the fact that that might spread. The residual issues of the Middle East, of Israel, Iran, etc., are there, and commodity prices impacting on commodity price inputs. So net, I think corporates are still uncertain. Our business grew last year, interestingly, because of that uncertainty. An unwillingness in the West to invest in capacity, in increasing fixed cost, Boards are terrified of making mistakes. The crises that we've seen at BP, at Goldman Sachs, the product recalls from Toyota makes boards, non-executive directors, extremely cautious. Who in their right minds would want to be a non-executive director of a public company? The risk-reward ratio just doesn't work. So what you do, and CEOs don't want to lose their jobs, what you do is you pull in your horns. You go for growth. And I just leave you with this observation. The IBC, which I'm chairman of here in Davos, did a survey in August of last year. 4 points. Uncertainty at an all-time high. Strategic response is investment in bricks and next 11. Biggest shortage is talent, despite high unemployment rates. The biggest challenge we face is youth unemployment. 25% in the UK, 40% in Spain and other markets. This is the biggest challenge that we face in the long term. And the last point, green is still golden. The two first points are the key ones. High uncertainty. What's the response? Investment in bricks and next 11, where you do see relative growth.
Very good. Jim?
Yeah, Michael, I think that, as Martin said, the first speakers nailed it on the sort of macro level on the economy. I think that Martin's summary that the love continues as far as the LUV, I think that's absolutely true. I think when you believe and think about the emerging markets, there's actually some changes taking place. You look at the IPOs, increasingly dramatic numbers coming from the emerging markets as opposed to the legacy of IPOs in the Atlantic region, as you've called it. I think you're seeing a huge immersion of E2E trade, just bypassing the developed markets. I think you're seeing, on top of that, some real shift in terms of investment and acquisition from the emerging markets to the developed markets. I think there's a few things that haven't been talked about that will be real important, not necessarily just in 2011, but beyond. And one is demographics. No one has talked about that. But if you look out to 2020, on balance, the average age of the population in China and the U.S. will be about the same, 37 or 38 years old. On balance, the average age of the population in Western Europe and Japan will be about the same, and it's going to be 47 or 48 years old. And on balance, the average age of the population in India and the Middle East is going to be 27 or 28 years old. This has enormous impact on an array of policy issues and certainly on economic prosperity and growth. Add to that the whole demographics around gender. I think demographics will be a big issue. I think we're also going to see, to your comment on sort of the Atlantic region, we've seen the same things Martin talked about as far as growth returning, which is great. But I think you're going to see increasing tension between public sector and private sector. What it has in many countries been a historic sort of deal that working in the public sector was safer. You didn't have to run the risk of being separated or out-counseled, and wages might have been a little bit lower. And now has turned around. In many countries in the last couple of years during the crisis, we've seen job gains in the public sector, massive job loss in private sector. We've seen total comp and benefits higher in the public sector, earlier retirement, bigger pensions. I think that's going to be an increasing source of tension. Third and final thing is I think as we move forward, the role of the entrepreneur is going to get a lot more important. We've all talked about jobs and the unemployment. Nobody builds jobs, nobody lifts communities, nobody lifts lives like entrepreneurs when they are uncertain. To Martin's point, they tend to stay on the sideline, out of the game. Making sure that countries do enough to encourage entrepreneurial activity, making sure that even big companies do enough to encourage entrepreneurship from within is going to be key.
I want to come back to your public sector, private sector split in a minute because I think there are some very interesting points that we can take on that. Let me come back to Nouriel and just get you to concentrate on one of your downside risks, which is sovereign debt risk, because you were very outspoken throughout the whole of last year or not outspoken, but sharply critical of the way in which the Europeans were handling their debt crisis. My guess is that if this meeting had taken place even 6 weeks ago, it would be European debt all the time. Are you still as worried as you were in the middle of last year that something could go badly wrong in the EU?
Yes, I'm worried. I think that there is a policy response that is more aggressive than was last year. But I think that you have four fundamental issues that you have to resolve in the Eurozone. The first one is you need more liquidity and official resources to avoid runs, and there's a risk of the contagion now spreading from Greece, Ireland, Portugal to places like Spain and Belgium. Spain is too big to fail, but also too big to be saved without greater official resources. So you need that. The Germans are still resisting. The second one is there are some countries that are effectively near insolvent. Greece, even if they do everything in the MFU program, they're going to end up with a public debt of 150% of GDP in 3 years. Argentina and Russia defaulted when their debt was at 50% of GDP. So we need orderly and early restructuring that are market-oriented of the public debt in the countries that are near insolvent. The Europeans are saying we're going to do it after 2013. That's a mistake. 3, we decide to socialize the private losses and put losses, for example, of the financial system. Look at Ireland, the balance sheets of the government, and now it's breaking the back of those governments, like in Ireland. You need an orderly restructuring of even senior unsecured bank debt. Again, that problem has been pushed to the future. And finally, there is no growth, and actually there is still outright contraction in most of the periphery. And if you're not going to have economic growth, you'll have 2 problems. One is the social and political backlash against austerity and reform is going to become worse because people don't see light at the end of the tunnel. 2, you have to stabilize debt and deficits in the private and public sector as a share of GDP. If GDP keeps on falling, stabilizing this thing, even with austerity, is not going to happen. And I don't think there is a strategy for resuming economic growth in the periphery of Eurozone. The policy of the ECB is too tight. The euro is too strong. There is fiscal austerity. There is a negative effect, however necessary, on economic growth. And there is no economic growth. There is continued contraction. So the mood in the market is slightly better, but I think that the fundamental problems of the Eurozone remain unsolved.
Just coming off that to Xiumin and Azim Premji, very provocative article in the Financial Times this morning by Kishore Mahbubani, great friend of many of ours, saying that people in Asia are now fed up with the West because they can't get their economic house in order. The Europeans can't sort out the sovereign debt crisis. The Americans can't sort out long-term budget deficits, and that Asians are getting fed up with being lectured to by Westerners. Do you think that's right, Azim? Do you think that's right, Xiumin?
Lectured? Go ahead.
You go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, of course.
Please go ahead.
This is a tough question. It's much easier for you to go ahead.
Quite sensitive. I didn't quite understand your question.
Do you think those in Asia are getting fed up with being lectured by Westerners on how to run their economies?
Frankly, speaking for India, I don't know too much about the rest of Asia. I don't think so. I think they're being fed up or being constantly needled to keep on opening their economies all the time. And there doesn't seem to be a two-way traffic on that. And people don't seem to equate in terms of liberalization, same principles applicable to products and services. And that's fundamental. I mean, if you're talking about global trade is products, global trade is services. And you cannot have one standards of opening up economies of emerging countries to products. And contra to that, you have policies, particularly in the United States, which put all kind of restrictions on imports of services. It just cannot be a one-way traffic.
So slightly fed up.
More than slightly fed up of that.
You come in.
I don't know how to define your concept, say, the fed up. I think the crisis obviously makes it very clear. We need to think deeply, as Jem pointed out, to further to think about what will be the economic model for this world. If you're looking for the advanced economy, when they reach, say, $30,000 per capita, and so it becomes norm, low growth rates, right, low inflation rates, very high social welfare package. Everybody was born with entitlement and with a big physical deficit. This is very much become the things, and why bother? Life is so good, right? And but then you will see three things. I think Jim had a point. Demographic change is number one, and number two is the globalization. So also, it's a very number three. Obviously, global resource restrictions, and the crisis made this very clear. This model not necessarily work.
Right.
I think it's for the whole emerging market in Asia, they are learning from this crisis, try to figure out what will be the good model for the Asian and for the world in the tomorrow. I think this is really the fundamental issues. I mean, Nouriel pointed out this correctly, because if you're looking for the physical problem, it's not for the today. It's in the future. If you factor into the non-funded liability on the welfare, on the pensions, and on the Medicares in the current today's budget deficits, you will see the numbers are huge, much bigger.
So Asians look at what the French would call the 30 glorious years after 1945, in which significant pensions and other welfare benefits were established, and are saying to themselves, we can't go down, that road won't work for us. We can't do that model.
I think this has become a clear message for the whole world. But Asia, emerging market in Asia, also got to be very careful, because there's 1 billion people living in the advanced economy, 3 billion people living in the emerging market. If you ask everyone in the emerging market, what is your life model in tomorrow? Right. They will say American life, a big house and big cars and a 4x4 UVS, and a pension entitlement, right? Yeah. And but it won't work, right? Because we absolutely don't have that resource to support the whole thing. So the whole world have to work together to figure out the model for tomorrow.
This question about hectoring or lecturing, I mean, I don't think it's just arisen, not in today's Financial Times. But remember, about 2 or 3 years ago, after Lehman, there was a lot of criticism that the West was not an exemplar for China or for India. We saw the growth of confidence in China and India rise extremely significantly in Brazil under Lula, and now under Dilma. We'll see it. We saw it, and we will continue to see it. And I think this is the issue. The real issue is, and again we saw it last night, an unwillingness to deal with the real gorilla in the room, which is the U.S. deficit issue. Unfortunately, it looks as though we're going to see postponement of dealing with that issue until after the next general election in America in 2012. Goodness knows what the position will be in 2013. So we sit here in Davos, hopefully in January in 2013. I don't know what we will be saying then. I mean, basically, if you're running a multinational company, the world really divides into 4 divisions. The top division is the bricks and next 11. I use a football analogy. The division 1 is the bricks and next 11, the civets. And in our industry, it would be the new media. Division 2 is the USA and Germany, because Germany is extremely strong, high value-added manufacturing, strong exports, has made a remarkable recovery. And we're seeing in Europe a shift to the east as well. The power of Russia, driven by energy, at $100 a barrel, the Russian economy works in spades. It works at $60 to $70. Poland and Germany. And the German investment in East Germany is paying off. And in our industry, I put free-to-air television in that second division as well. Third division would be Western continental Europe, perhaps the UK moving up into the second division, but Nouriel is a bit skeptical about the front-loaded deficit reduction plan of the UK, but at least they tried to deal with the issue, or are trying to deal with the issue. And I put newspapers and periodicals the most challenged by new media. Division 4 is Japan. Japan shows no signs. It's a 20-year sort of stagnation, and so it shows no signs of getting out of it. When you're faced with that, the message is clear what you do with a multinational company, where you make your investments in capacity and growth, and you don't make it in the Western core.
Jim, come on in, and then I'll come back to your
discussion of sort of, are they getting fed up with being lectured, turned into a discussion of trade. I work on President Obama's Export Council, and we spend a lot of time talking about trade. It's astonishing. There's some 600 free trade agreements around the world. The U.S. is party to less than 20 of them. Right. And, he's made a big deal, positive in my judgment, to get the Korean free trade deal passed. But, it still has to go through the process, and not enough progress on Panama, not enough progress on Colombia. Clearly, a whole Pan-Pacific free trade agreement needs to come. And I think trade is going to be incredibly important. One of the things that I do fear is that global cooperation is going to get harder, not easier, as the recovery continues to go. And so, as Nouriel said, trade protectionism could creep in, whether it's through currency or other ways, and I think that's something we're really worried about.
Nouriel and I were at a dinner last night where the following topics were raised in terms of insignificant international cooperation. Trade imbalance, I made a note, trade imbalances, capital flows, water resources, carbon emissions, innovation and immigration. On all of those points, people were saying at the dinner that there was insufficient international cooperation.
Well, Martin's comments as well about the U.S. deficit. There's been beginning talk, but it does look like we need a heck of a lot more action on it.
The question is whether it's pragmatism or realism.
Exactly.
I mean, is the president idealistically opposed to this, or is he moving to the center? Was the speech like? I think Nouriel feels that it was a more centrist speech, but we haven't seen.
I think there was positive movement.
Zoom in. Come on. Sorry, Jim. Sorry. Zoom in. Come on.
Yeah, you mentioned it's a global cooperation. I think it's really the urgent issue. And yes, everybody talk about it because the crisis more or less a little bit passed away, although we're not over there yet. So the urgency is not there. I will say it's absolutely not true. Because what you say, as Martin says, is global policy cycle is in very different stage, right? If you're looking for the advanced economy, particularly Europeans, they are very much on tight the fiscal policy, a little bit of accommodating monetary policy in most advanced economy. U.S. is very outlier within the G7. So U.S. has both accommodating fiscal policy and monetary policy as well. They're still on the way. If you're looking for the emerging market, it's very much a tight monetary policy, a little neutral fiscal policy now. And so all the policies in the different area, but the world is still in a very fragile situation. As Martin says, and he was surprised we are. I think that's true because, Martin, you're a big corporate. Big corporate is in fantastic situations. You have a very high profit margin, very high productivities. You have a lot of cash. But it's not the overall picture. If you're looking for SMEs, they are pretty challenging today. But moreover, if you're looking for the GDP, yes, we had a very strong GDP in the past years, but it's very much a rebound. Overall, I think we need to look about output level. If you're looking for the output level, end of last year, the world output level equivalent to the output level of the peak. That's 2008. That means in 2 years, we have a zero incremental growth of GDP. So that's the real situations. So in that sense, how do we coordinate the global economic, monetary, and fiscal and policies and move the whole global economy forward? I think it's absolutely the most important issue today.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the problem we're facing are global, whether it's global imbalances, monetary and financial stability, climate change, energy security, food security, trade issues, and so on. And the G7 or the G8 became obsolete, and now we have moved to G20. But there is not much cooperation occurring, on monetary and fiscal, on exchange rate there is disagreement, but also on the bigger long-term picture issues from trade to climate change to what to do with energy, there is no agreement. So instead of having a G20, I think we're going to a world that is a G0 world, which there is no leader, and there is not even a G2, and there is disagreement on all the fundamental short-term, medium, and long-term issues. So there is no global economic and policy governance.
The G0 world. Jim, you mentioned tensions between the public sector and the private sector, particularly in the U.S. Perhaps another, who knows, million jobs to be lost in state and local governments as they put their budget houses in order as the private sector rebounds. Nouriel identified high unemployment in the U.S. as a real risk. Cover of The Atlantic this month, fabulous article by Christian Friedland. The rise of the new ruling class, how the global elite is leaving you behind. And the Harvard Business Review, a terrific piece by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, which starts off by saying, the capitalist system is under siege. In recent years, business increasingly has been viewed as a major cause of social, environmental, and economic problems. The legitimacy of business has fallen to levels not seen in recent history. Crikey! So, as international businessmen like you lie awake at night, I mean, do you hear the rattle of tumbrils and the clacking of tricoteuses knitting needles? Do you think revolution is on the way? No, you don't. No.
Shall I?
Yeah, come on. Either of you.
You lie awake at night?
I mean,
no, I think it is a serious issue. I mean, if you see what is happening in North Africa and the potential, we were talking before about today as a crucial day in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. I just came from the Sundance Film Festival. There's a film called The Flaw, F-L-A-W, which picks up on Alan Greenspan's testimony to Congress and the flaw that he saw in the model. And what it does, a very interesting graph in it, which tracks inequality, the concentration of wealth in the United States from 1920 to today. And the inequality peaked in 1929. And I think I'm right, it peaked at about 2007, maybe even a little bit later than that. And this issue about inequality is a matter of economic debate. They had Schiller in it. I think is it Lewis Byron in it as well. Stieglitz in it. We're all interviewed, and it's this question about whether inequality. Wealthy people invest in financial assets. They create asset bubbles. Whereas if wealth is more distributed, there's an investment in more mass consumption and therefore capacity, and economies prosper more as a result. So this concentration of wealth, particularly in the United States, I think is a big issue. And how you deal with it, whether you then attack it by increasing marginal tax rates, obviously controversial. Whether that's the issue, we were talking again about this before, and I think, Nouriel, you were of the view that may be one of the policy. To deal with the deficit, you have to increase tax rates. And they have to come either from direct taxation or indirect taxation. And what this film was talking about was the wisdom, maybe, of increasing direct rates, particularly on the more wealthy. Not a popular message in some sections of the economy.
Jim, do you want to come in?
You know, Michael, it is interesting. Every business person around the world has, we've all been in the same bucket, demonized over the last several years, and maybe it began at the peak of inequality of earnings in 2007. I think I'm beginning to detect a little bit of a change as there became a realization that the more business activity and private sector activity is demonized, the less of it you're going to get and the less job growth you're going to get. And so at the end of the day, I think that there has been at least a tone change from Washington on that point that I think might actually begin to move the cycle back towards recognizing that we all need to figure out how to coordinate globally. We all need to get across the difficulties between countries around trade, and we all need to figure out that businesses need to succeed in order to have employment for people. But we don't have the exact path yet. I thought the State of the Union did a nice job of talking about competitiveness around taxes, around trade, talked about tone, but as Martin said, it lacked details. So I'm not sure.
It was big on vision.
Right, big on vision.
I just want to come back to what Nouriel said about G0, which I think we should have credited. I think it was Ian Bremmer's piece, came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago, which I commend everybody to read, where he talks about there isn't a G7 or G8, or there is the risk there is not a G7 or G8 or G20. There's really a G0. What he's talking about is the rise of protectionism, the sort of things that we are seeing in Africa and elsewhere. And I don't want to blow Klaus Schwab's trumpet too loudly, but I do think we don't have an international or a multinational business organization like a G20 or a G7 or a G8. It doesn't exist. And one of the things that was discussed in Seoul at the last G20 meeting and got some momentum was the issue of a voice for multinational business to deal with the sort of issues you're raising, Michael. Because business is not seen in a good light. If you look at all the trust indices that PR companies like our own and others put out, business is very much at the low end of the totem pole. It's not just bankers, it's not just investment bankers or commercial bankers, it's business as a whole. And it is a very serious issue. It mirrors the issue that we were talking about in the hectoring of the West or the lecturing of the West to the East or the South or the Southeast. And I think it is something that leading business people are going to talk about here with, I think, President Sarkozy in the context of his presidency of the G20. It's something that we must wrestle with. Because things like the Business Council are US bodies, and it's all very fractured. Bringing it together, one voice, if we manage to do that, develop a voice to influence policy in a constructive way, I think is needed.
Michael, real quickly on this, because Sir Martin mentioned the IBC earlier that he chairs. I remember at an IBC summer meeting, this is a group of the CEOs of many of the big companies at WEF, there was a discussion, to your point, of is capitalism like dead, and we need to figure out something to put in its place. The feedback from the IBC members from the emerging economies of China and India were go slow on that. They said that from their perspective, much of sort of free market capitalism has been the best thing to help lift economies in their parts of the world, and so they were exercising caution as far as tossing out too quickly. It was an interesting dichotomy.
Jumin, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. And the increase in inequality, obviously, the most serious challenge we're facing today for the whole world.
The most serious challenge
we're facing today for the whole world, not only from the advanced economy, but also from the emerging market, but obviously from different causes. I mean, in the emerging market, because the very strong growth and increase, the distribution issues and the income gap increase, but in advance as well. But I would like to follow up on Martin's comments. I think it's not only the tax issues. We need to go further. The first question is, if you see the income really diverging in the past 10 years, the first question is how and where this wealth has been created. I think this is the most important. You're absolutely right. If you're looking for U.S. cases, the inequality peaked in 2028 before the big crisis. 1% American hold roughly 48% wealth. I'm talking about wealth, not talking about the wage. After the crisis, it was Jim Jiang. In 1968, roughly 1% American hold 28% of the whole U.S. wealth. Getting up in 2000, it's become 42. 2008, go back to 47% again. But if you see behind that, it's always a parallel with the booming of the stock market and the financial sector. So let's go back to the fundamental questions where the wealth should be created. And then is the wealth should be distributed, then redistributed. So I think we have to go back to fundamentals, fit this into our growth model, as I mentioned before. I think it is a very important issue. So many issues to tell us that we cannot let the income disparities increase further. The crisis gave a break, but I don't think the world paid enough attention on these issues.
And just to underline one of your first comments on that intervention, Jumin, inequality is not just a rich, developed world problem. On the contrary, as growth has been speeding up in the developing world, it's become a problem anyway.
It's everyone.
You have the India Inclusive campaign here in Davos, which is dealing with this issue in the context, or attempting to deal with this issue in the context of Indian growth and development, that it's becoming too high and low, too rich and poor oriented.
And the political instability that you see right now, for example, in the Middle East is not just food prices. There is inequality, there is corruption, high levels of unemployment rate among the young people. So this is a very dangerous combination of factors, and certainly the income and wealth inequality exacerbates those things.
I have a feeling that inequality is going to be one of the key words of Davos this year, actually. Let's take some questions. Gentlemen over here, I'm sure there'll be, that there will be microphones. I think one is heading your way right as we speak. One here and then over here. Gentlemen in the front row, please. If you could state your name, that would be great.
Good morning. Gerard Lyons from Standard Chartered. And congratulate the panel on the fantastic debate. It's not so much a question as a comment that I'd welcome the panel's observations on. A couple of years ago, Obama's Chief of Staff, Trevor Emanuel, or Mr. Emanuel, said you shouldn't waste a good crisis. What's very interesting is across the emerging world, it seems to me, they've taken that to heart. One of the most interesting things that the panel hasn't talked about yet is the fact that in the West, people assume value will be created in the West, and the West needs to sort of stay ahead up the value curve. One of the most interesting observations we've seen at Standard Chartered in the last 2 years is the extent to which emerging economies have really moved up the value curve. And this year's 12th five-year plan from China is a further sign of that. And just to finish, it's not just China and India. What's interesting is the infrastructure boom we're seeing on the ground across Africa, in the Middle East. It reinforces this new trade corridor aspect across the emerging world, intra-Asia, Asia-Africa, Asia-Middle East. And basically, it seems to me the challenges are going to be as great in the future as Mr. Zumin and others touched on for the West and for the SMEs. But it's a very interesting dynamic that be interesting to hear the panel's observations on.
It's something we were touching on in the green room earlier. Martin, I mean, you and I were talking about the extent to which innovation and new business practices are being discovered in the developing world.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to get out of the lexicon the words developing or emerging. You know, China is a $5 trillion economy. Against 15 trillion, it's true for the US, out of 65 trillion, whatever it is worldwide, but we must get out of the lexicon. There are other countries, absolutely. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan, despite the political problems. The other thing is, we all talk about shift from west to east. It's actually a shift from west to east, west to south. This is the decade of Latin America. Brazil with the World Cup and the Olympics certainly is going to be very important in the context of Latin America, but other countries, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, the Andina region. We've seen the stock exchanges coming together. And indeed, the Southeast. Africa, your point about Africa and the Middle East, we've seen in our industry great growth. The Chinese really understand, the suggestion that there are 800,000 Chinese working in African countries on various infrastructure, energy projects, food projects, suggests they, as usual, state-directed capitalism works. Having a Politburo of engineers running an economy, not a bad system.
Azim, it's a very interesting concept which is coming up now, whether it be in India or whether it be in China, but I think it's really come up in India, the concept of reverse engineering of products.
Yeah.
The moment multinationals wish to address a mass market which requires high volume, very low price points, they cannot think in terms of mindsets of an American sitting in Milwaukee or mindsets of an automobile design engineer sitting in Detroit. And a very interesting case study on this, which really brings out this contrast, is Ford's entry into India. Fords were pioneers into India, and Ford is a very successful company globally. And they wanted to bring a mid-end car to India. And they figured that the mid-end car would be more cost-effective. If it was more cost-effective, would be able to generate more volume. So a car which was typically selling in the United States at about $20,000, they tried to re-engineer in India. Re-engineer for India, sitting in Detroit with Detroit engineers, and figured one way they could bring down, one among many ways they could bring down the cost of the car, was to see to it that power windows were removed on half the car, the backside of the car. But they didn't realize that a car at $15,000 in India would be bought by wealthy people, and wealthy people had drivers, chauffeurs. So you provided power windows for the driver, you did not provide power windows for the occupants of the car. And this is an actual case history. We have a joint venture with General Electric in healthcare system. And we have today 1,500 engineers working for producing products, cardiology equipment, low-end ultrasound equipment, baby warmers, specifically tailored to the emerging markets. And the interesting thing is not only do they cater across the world to emerging markets, whether it be Africa, China, Latin America, but because of the huge demand of value and cost by global customers, including Western customers, is becoming a very interesting re-export market back into the developed world.
Yeah,
Nouriel, come on in.
I think the point was made about the rise of emerging markets. They're going to be a source of high economic growth for the global economy. Then the question is, where are going to be the sources of growth for advanced economies? And here I see 4 challenges and 4 sources of trouble. One is demographics. Aging of population reduces potential growth. It's a problem in Japan. It's a problem in Europe. The second one is that you need structural reforms in all advanced economies. Those structural reforms are occurring more slowly and is desirable and optimal. Look at Europe, look at Japan. 3, we need to invest into education, into infrastructure to become more productive and competitive. That's not occurring at the rate it should be. And 4, now we have these sovereign debt problems, large budget deficit, rising stocks of public debt that may be clamping on potential growth. So unless the West and advanced economy address the fundamental problem, it's going to be a big issue.
Question just back here and then at the front. Questions as quick as we can. Thanks.
Vincent van Quickenborg, Minister of Economy from Belgium. I like the idea of putting, Sir Martin, Germany in Division 2. It has to do with export to emerging markets, especially China. Well, yesterday some interesting figures were published about China. Actually, that private consumption contributed 3.9% to the total economic growth of 10.3% in 2010 in China. That is the lowest since 2003, and is not, in fact, not fulfilling what Mr. Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao said when they started as premier and president. So far for rebalancing, I would say. My question to the man known as Nouriel on Twitter is the Chinese state capitalist model in the long term sustainable?
Well, I think that you're pointing out an important problem, that the model of China so far has been one of export-led industrialization and growth, based on a cheap currency and relying on net exports and on fixed investment. And consumption has been very low, around 36% of GDP. So the challenge that China is facing is that the U.S. cannot be anymore the consumer first and last resort, spending more than its income and running ever larger current account deficit, so that China can be the producer of first and last resort, spending less than its income and running ever larger surpluses. And therefore, you need to reduce savings rate and increase consumption. There are structural reasons why the Chinese save a lot, both the corporate sector and the household sector, and why the Chinese don't consume. There is a plan, a 5-year plan about changing that. We'll see. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge that China is going to be facing, to move away from net exports to greater reliance on consumption and reduction of savings. We'll see whether that can happen.
Yeah, I guess I have to. I guess you're China exports because you can pronounce Hu Jintao and Wenjiabo very well in Chinese way. And I'm very much impressed. But I do have a slightly different data from yours. The last year, Chinese GDP, if you're looking overall, consumption contributed 47.6%. The fixed capital information still contributed 48.2%, so slightly more than consumption. The exports contribute the rest of us a little bit of 3%. So if you're looking for the net exports contribution for the GDP growth rate last year was negative, because the China current account surplus dropped dramatically from 10.8% 2007 to last year, roughly a little bit more than 4%. And I'm very positive we'll see the Chinese export surplus were on downside this year and in year forward, because it's very clear China cannot rely on the export growth model. I mean, in the 1998, the big lesson for the Asian economies, you cannot rely external capital flow. So the forex piled up. And this crisis gave a big lesson for the Asia emerging markets. You cannot rely on external demand. This is very simple, but until you have been hit badly, you will not take a lesson. Right. So what you see this last year is quite a big change on the export burden within the emerging Asia as well. We will see further the emerging market go move into the domestic consumption-driven model. Only I concern the U.S. pick it up, need more import. They will cause another issue.
The Chinese consumer has to have some things. For example, healthcare. What we see with our 12,000 people in mainland China is a concern about saving for older life, old age,
parents,
healthcare. And until that is done, and Nouriel referred to the latest 5-year plan, it was referred to before, until that is in place, the Chinese consumer is not going to feel secure enough to spend in the way that we in the West would like to see them.
Well, pension and healthcare is all things, but the reform on those things also on the way.
Adam?
Adam Lashinsky with Fortune magazine. Jim, if I heard you correctly, you seem to suggest that the negative tone in the U.S. business community would cause U.S. business leaders to cut down their activity, which strikes me as the equivalent of the saying, well, if you don't play nice with me on the schoolyard, I'm going to take my bat and ball and leave the schoolyard, which, bellyaching notwithstanding, isn't how fiduciaries typically behave. So my question to you is, with Jeff Immelt chairing the President's Jobs Council and the President's more conciliatory tone, are we past that now? And Zhumin, if you could comment, how did the Chinese leadership view this spat between the U.S. administration and the U.S. corporate community?
Yeah, well, let me address it first. I wasn't implying to take your bat and ball and go home. I think that the combination of the tenor of discussion around the business community and the uncertainty that existed on a policy level, whether it was the extensive discussions around healthcare, around financial reform, around cap and trade, around card check policy, labor policy, around debt reduction policy, every one of these policy balls that were being juggled, every business leader knew that when the ball hit the table, it would impact them. And the combination of sort of the rhetoric and the policy uncertainty caused companies, I think in many cases, to quite understandably be a little cautious. I do think we're moving in a very positive direction, and I think that on both settling down some of the policy issues and having Jeff Immelt and others work with the administration around this tone, I think we're moving in the right path.
Do you want to comment, Jimmy?
Well, thanks for the question, but I have to say the first thing is I'm now with IMF, so I consider myself very much an international citizen. I even don't pay for U.S. tax things, and so I'm no longer in the position as a deputy governor in China, and so I'm not properly in the position to answer your question. But as a Washingtonian, I like 1,000 miles away. My sense is, I think Jim laid out on certain big issues, but I really see U.S. need a growth strategy.
Question right at the front, and then we'll try and squeeze one in the back. Gentleman right here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Luigi Buttiglione from Bevan Howard Investment Products. Two questions, one on risk and the second one on U.S. policy. If I go back to last year, in the end, the so-called Davos consensus, at least with my colleagues, we came back with the impression that the so-called the thinkers or the policymakers were a little bit on the pessimistic side, and the corporate sector was on more on the optimistic side last year. Well, it proved, if we look at last year's experience, in the end, I would say that the latter group of people were more right than the first one. In the end, last year growth was close to 5% for the world, which is quite a good year. Actually, here I have a little bit different statistics for Mr. Zumin. I think that for the year, at the end of last year, world GDP was something like 3% above the previous peak. So it was not a bad. So if we look back forward to this year, now going to the half empty, half full glass of Nouriel, Roubini, where do you see risk? Do you see risk that actually we could be surprised again on the high side? And I would say, with especially a glance at inflation. And the second question, very quickly, it's about policy in the U.S. What do you think about energy taxes? Because I think the gorilla, as someone said, is the big thing, the U.S. policy. And I think it's something we all discuss, and we'd like to know what you think about that.
Let's just quickly, do you think we're going to be surprised on the upside? I don't think you do you?
Well, I pointed out what could be the upside risk coming from EM, from the fact that the corporate sector is strong, there is a global recovery. But I do worry about the Eurozone. I do worry about commodity prices rising. I do worry about housing and labor market in the United States. I worry about the policy response of China and other countries and how they're going to manage capital inflows. And I also worry about the whole series of, I would say, geopolitical risk. Again, food and social and political instability, Iran, Israel, North-South Korea, terrorism. Look what happened in Moscow the other day, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even cyber terrorism. So there are lots of things that could go wrong. The markets right now are optimistic. The CEOs are more optimistic. That's a positive, but we should not underestimate there are a number of significant potential downside risks to the global economy.
Martin,
I don't think corporates were optimistic like this time last year. I think we became more optimistic as we went through the year. I just recount. In 2009, we forecast -2 on our revenues. We did -8. 2010, we said 0. We did 5. A little bit better than 5. This year, we're budgeting 5. I think, I hope, we'll be in line with where it actually turns out. I think this year is the same again as last year, except there will be a move more in our industry, well, in the industries we follow, to BRICS and Next 11. There'll be more rebalancing there and more to digital. Last year, I think, was more about, I call it dead cat bounce, it's a bit unfair, but it was the result of the stimulus. If you put $12 trillion into the world's economy, there has to be a rebound. And that came in 2010. 2011, I think, will be more balanced and more back to where we are. Maybe not the new reality that we were meant to be discussing this morning.
I'll leave everyone with 3 of my takeaways. One, it isn't just India and China, that countries like Bangladesh and Argentina, and even you said Pakistan, are showing remarkable growth. Secondly, keep an eye on Egypt today. And thirdly, Xiumin's comment that inequality is the single biggest problem facing the global economy, rich countries and poor countries alike. It's been a fantastic opening panel. Please thank my panelists very much.